Okay, let's dive right into this fascinating era by exploring what happened in the late 1960s when the radical, groundbreaking ideas of modern art simply became the new, boring establishment. For decades, you see, the modernists were the ultimate rule breakers, but eventually their abstract paintings filled the walls of elite museums, and they basically became the exact tradition they had initially fought against. The art world was primed for a completely new kind of shakeup.
So a new generation of artists looks around and starts asking, wait, why does art have to be so serious? Why does it have to be so high-minded and universal? Looking at the incredibly elite museum culture of the time, they decided to set off a witty, chaotic, and deeply skeptical rebellion. They didn't just want to break a few rules of tradition, they wanted to ask why those rules even existed in the first place. They figured, let's mess with it.
To demystify all this, here is our agenda for this explainer. 1. The postmodern mindset. 2. The new art toolkit. 3. Decades of artistic rebellion. And 4. The ultimate showdown.
Let's start with Section 1, the postmodern mindset, a skeptical posture. You know, postmodernism isn't actually a single recognizable visual style like Cubism. It's really more of an attitude. While modernism was earnestly searching for the next big thing and believed in a linear sense of progress, postmodernism completely throws that out. Instead, it crosses its arms and uses humor, satire, and deep irony to critique everything around it, from politics to consumer culture to figures of authority. It is a fundamental shift in how we look at the world. Because of this new attitude, the old boundaries totally collapsed. We get this anything goes mentality. Suddenly, a pristine, elite museum painting was playing on the exact same field as everyday comic books, advertising, or even graffiti on a city wall. High art, low art. That dividing line just vanished. These artists rarely took anything at face value anymore.
And that intense skepticism leads us straight to deconstructivism. This era is deeply tied to this concept, which means artists actively tried to dismantle what society accepted as universal facts. They wanted to show that truth isn't some fixed object you can hold in your hand. It's almost always just a matter of who is telling the story and from what perspective.
Moving right along to Section 2, the new art toolkit, stealing, mashing, and conceptualizing.
So you might be wondering, how do you actually make art when you completely reject traditional painting and sculpture? Well, you build an entirely new arsenal, and you start with appropriation, or in plain terms, the art of stealing. Postmodern artists frequently and intentionally borrow, copy, or remix existing images from history or pop culture. And the kicker? They aren't trying to hide the fact that they didn't create the original image. The borrowing is literally the entire point. Here is a brilliant example of that. The artist Sherry Levine famously took photographs of Walker Evans' iconic Depression-era photos, and then she boldly exhibited them under her own name. Seriously? By literally stealing these famous photos, Levine forced audiences to stop and aggressively question the whole concept of originality, as well as the historical dominance of male figures in the art world.
From there, the creative toolkit just exploded. You had pastiche and mashups, where architects would combine sleek, modern glass facades with ancient Roman columns. You had conceptual art, where the conversation triggered in your brain mattered vastly more than the physical piece on the wall. And artists moved entirely away from canvases to create new mediums, transforming entire rooms into immersive installations, or, like Marina Abramovich, turning their own bodies into temporary performance art.
Okay, Section 3, Decades of Artistic Rebellion, the Rule Breakers. Let's see how this toolkit builds into distinct waves of artists who weaponized these exact techniques. We can trace this journey through a few iconic movements, starting in the media-saturated 1970s, moving through a chaotic return to painting in the 1980s, and right up to the pure shock tactics of the 1990s.
Kicking things off in the 70s, we get the pictures generation. These were artists who grew up totally saturated by mass media, television, and advertising, and they decided to use those exact mediums to critique society. Cindy Sherman took incredibly staged self-portraits masquerading as cliché Hollywood bay-movie actresses to expose how media shapes female identity. Meanwhile, Barbara Kruger layered highly aggressive text like "I shop therefore I am" right over black and white advertisement imagery. Then, the 1980s brought us neo-expressionism. This was a raw, chaotic return to painting that fiercely rejected the cold minimalism of late modernism. Jean-Michel Basquiat is the absolute perfect example here.
He blended graffiti, poetry, anatomy drawings, and a heavy social critique of racism straight onto raw, unstretched canvases. He brilliantly bridged the massive gap between gritty street culture and high-end fine art galleries.
By the 1990s, we get the Young British Artists, or the YBAs. They were famous for intense shock tactics, an almost corporate entrepreneurial spirit, and using completely bizarre materials. Damien Hirst literally shoved a preserved 14-foot wild tiger shark into a massive glass tank of formaldehyde. No way, right? But by using that extreme shock value, he forced viewers to stand in a gallery and confront mortality and commercialism head-on.
Which brings us to Section 4, the ultimate showdown, modernism versus postmodernism. To truly understand this new guard, we have to put them in a side-by-side showdown with the old guard. Notice the massive shift we've been talking about, from the serious, idealistic search for universal truth in modernism to the ironic, playful skepticism of postmodernism. The artist goes from being viewed as a lone visionary genius to acting more like a cultural commentator or, frankly, a cultural thief. And the very definition of art expands from a specific, elite object of beauty to literally anything: a concept, a performance, a tweet, or even a literal trash can.
If you take away just one thing from this explainer, let it be this central shift in approach, moving from the immense pressure of having to make it new and create entirely original objects, to a freedom where artists could just recycle it, mixing, matching, and quoting the past to create entirely new meaning. That shift is the absolute bedrock of the visual era we live in today.
Now that you know the rules haven't just been bent, but entirely thrown out the window, I want to leave you with this final thought. If an idea matters more than technical skill, and if literally anything can be framed as a critique of modern life, how do you define art? Ponder that the next time you step into a gallery, or even just scroll through your phone. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the rules, and I'll see you next time.